It was a quiet Saturday morning, the kind where the world seems to move slower. The air smelled like freshly cut grass, and the neighborhood kids were riding their bikes up and down the street. For most people, it was just another weekend. But for John Miller, that morning would be the beginning of something he never imagined. A fight with the very community he thought he belonged to. John had been living in that neighborhood for nearly 10 years. He wasn't the loud or showy type. He kept to himself mostly, took care of his property, helped a neighbor when they needed it, and always followed the rules. He'd served in the Navy for more than 2 decades and carried that same discipline into his everyday life. The kind of man who folded his shirts with sharp corners and made sure his tools were always in the right place. His pride and joy, though, was his truck, a dark blue Ford F-250. It wasn't brand new, but he kept it spotless. Every weekend he would wash and wax it until it shined. It wasn't just a vehicle to him. It was a piece of his life. That truck had been with him through moves, storms, and long drives to see family. It reminded him of freedom, of open roads and quiet moments. So when he found the first envelope taped to his front door, he didn't think much of it. It had the Homeowners Association logo on it, the same one he saw in the newsletters that came once a month. He figured it was some update about lawn maintenance or a new rule about trash bins, but as soon as he opened it, his brow furrowed. Inside was a notice saying he had violated the community's parking policy. According to the letter, his truck was considered a commercial vehicle and couldn't be parked in the driveway overnight. It also stated he owed a $75 fine for the infraction. John stood there, holding the paper, reading it twice to make sure he wasn't misunderstanding something. Commercial vehicle? He looked out the window toward his driveway. His Ford sat there, gleaming under the sunlight. No logos, no equipment, no company markings, just a clean personal truck. He shook his head, thinking it must be a mistake. Later that afternoon, he walked down to the small HOA office near the community park. It was run by a few residents who volunteered their time, or at least that's what they said. Inside, the office smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. Behind the desk sat a woman he'd seen before, though he didn't know her name. She looked up from her computer and smiled politely. "Good afternoon," John said, holding up the letter. "I think there's been a mistake. I received this notice about my truck, but it's not a commercial vehicle." The woman glanced at the paper, then shrugged. "You'll have to talk to the board about that. I just handle communications. You can submit an appeal if you like." John asked for the form and filled it out right there, explaining in plain words that his truck was privately owned, used for personal reasons, and did not violate any rules. He handed it back and left, thinking that would be the end of it. After all, how hard could it be to correct a small error? A week later, another letter arrived. This one was thicker. It stated that his appeal had been denied, and that an additional late fee had been added to the fine. Now he owed $150. He frowned, reading every line carefully. There was no explanation, no reasoning, just a bold sentence saying, "Violation remains unresolved." He walked out to his driveway again, staring at the truck as if it could explain something. It hadn't moved, hadn't changed. The same clean, quiet Ford sitting right where it always did. That night he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the letter spread out in front of him. He wasn't angry, not yet, but confused. The HOA wasn't supposed to work like this. He paid his dues on time, followed the community guidelines, even helped organize a neighborhood cleanup 2 years earlier. Why would they target him over something so small? He decided to call the number on the letter the next morning. After being put on hold for nearly 15 minutes, a voice finally came on the line. It was a man this time, speaking quickly and without much patience. "Yes, Mr. Miller, your vehicle has been classified under our guidelines as a non-compliant type. You'll need to either park it inside a garage or remove it from the property overnight." John's tone stayed calm. "Sir, with all due respect, my vehicle is not commercial." "There's nothing on it that would make it one. I checked the rules when I bought this place." The man paused. "Our standards have been updated this year. It's your responsibility to review the new handbook." And with that, the call ended. Just like that. No discussion. No consideration. Over the next few weeks, the letters didn't stop. They kept coming, each one more serious than the last. The fines added up quickly, and the language in the notices became more aggressive. Words like final warning and legal action began to appear. John tried again to reach out. Emails, phone calls, even stopping by the office. But no one would give him a straight answer. It was as if the whole thing had become personal. Then came the first real shock. One evening as the sun began to set, John found a bright orange sticker on his windshield. It was a notice of pending enforcement. The message was short and direct. Failure to comply will result in vehicle removal. He peeled it off slowly, reading it twice. His stomach tightened. Someone from the HOA had actually come onto his property and put this there. It wasn't just about a fine anymore. They were threatening to take his truck. He sat on the edge of his porch that night, thinking about everything. He wasn't the type to jump to anger. Years in the Navy had taught him patience, the kind of patience that only comes from long deployments and unpredictable seas. But this was different. It wasn't about money. It was about being treated unfairly, about losing something that meant more than a piece of metal with wheels. The next morning, he went through the HOA handbook himself. He read every single page, marking lines with a pen, and sure enough, the section about commercial vehicles clearly stated that the rule applied to vehicles with visible business logos or attached equipment. His truck had neither. He highlighted the sentence and made a copy. Then he drafted another letter, polite but firm, attaching photos of his truck in the handbook section. He dropped it off at the office and kept a copy for his records. Days passed. Then weeks. No response. By the third week, another envelope came, this time marked urgent. It claimed he owed over $900 in accumulated fines. $900 and for something that wasn't even real. That's when frustration started to build. He wasn't a man who liked to fight, but he wasn't about to let anyone push him around either. He started noticing little things around the neighborhood, the way certain board members would glance at him when he drove by, how one neighbor mentioned hearing complaints about his truck blocking the view of the street, which wasn't true. It became clear that someone on the HOA had decided to make an example out of him. Still, he kept calm. He documented everything, letters, photos, dates, times. He wanted a record in case this went further, because something told him it would. One Thursday afternoon, he came home from running errands and found a small crowd gathered near his driveway. A tow truck sat parked on the curb. The driver was checking paperwork, and a man in a polo shirt with a clipboard stood beside him. The HOA logo was printed on his shirt pocket. John stepped out of his car and walked up slowly. "Can I help you?" he asked evenly. The man with the clipboard didn't look up. "We're here to remove this vehicle for non-compliance and unpaid fines," he said flatly. John looked at the man, then at his truck. His voice stayed steady, but there was a firmness behind it. "You're not touching that truck." The man smirked slightly as if he'd expected resistance. "Sir, the board has authorized this action. If you have a complaint, you can take it up with—" John cut him off gently. "I'll handle this right now. You're not taking it anywhere today." The driver hesitated, sensing something in John's tone. Not anger, but authority. He lowered the tow hook slowly. The man with the clipboard sighed, muttered something under his breath, and made a phone call. Within minutes, they packed up and left. John stood there watching them go, feeling both relief and a deep, growing irritation. He didn't shout, didn't make a scene. But inside, a line had been crossed. And once that happened, he knew he wasn't going to let it slide. That night, he sat back at his table, going over every document again. The letters, the rules, the photos, everything. If they wanted a fight, he would give them one, but he'd do it by the book. That's how he'd always done things. Calm, steady, precise. As he looked out the window at his truck sitting peacefully in the driveway, he couldn't help but smile a little. They had no idea who they were dealing with, not just a homeowner, but a man who had commanded people, managed crises, and spent a lifetime standing up to challenges much bigger than this. And deep down, he already knew. This was just the beginning. The following week felt strange in the neighborhood. John noticed how quiet things seemed, as if everyone had heard about what happened, but no one wanted to say it out loud. The same people who used to wave when he passed by now just nodded politely, or avoided eye contact altogether. He didn't blame them. Most of them probably didn't want to get on the HOA's bad side. That was how it worked in places like this. Peace and smiles as long as you didn't question the people in charge. John didn't make a big deal out of it. He went on with his routine, early morning walks, yard work, small repairs around the house. But he could feel something brewing beneath the surface. Every time he saw that white HOA truck drive through the neighborhood, Stopping to take photos or measure lawns, he felt a quiet mix of irritation and curiosity. What did they want now? A few days later, another letter came. It was short, printed in bold letters. It said the fines had now exceeded $200 and that legal action would begin if payment wasn't received in 10 days. At the bottom was a signature he recognized. Carl, the HOA president. John had seen Carl a few times before at community meetings. He was the type who liked being in charge, always standing in front of the crowd talking about standards and community image. He often spoke as if the neighborhood was his personal project. John remembered once hearing him brag about how he'd cleaned up several properties that didn't fit the neighborhood look. Now it made sense who was behind all this. John decided to call the number listed at the bottom of the letter, the one that said direct inquiries. Carl answered after a few rings. His voice was smooth but carried that sharp edge that people use when they think they have power. "This is Carl," he said. "Carl, this is John Miller from Maple Ridge Lane," John replied calmly. "I just received another letter about supposed fines. I'd like to clear this up." There was a pause, then Carl said, "Mr. Miller, we've gone over this several times. Your vehicle doesn't meet our aesthetic standards. You were notified months ago." John's tone stayed polite but firm. "It's not a commercial vehicle, and I have the handbook that proves it. You've denied my appeals without reason. I've done everything by your own rules." Carl sighed loudly through the phone. "Look, you can either comply or face legal consequences. I don't make exceptions." "That's funny," John said quietly. "Because I know you do." There was a moment of silence. Then Carl's voice tightened. "Excuse me?" John didn't raise his voice. "I've seen your neighbor's van parked overnight. It's got a full company logo on it, yet somehow there's no fine on his windshield." Carl didn't reply. The silence said enough. "I'll handle this differently," John continued, "but I'm not paying a cent for something that isn't wrong." He ended the call before Carl could respond. His heart was steady. He'd been in worse confrontations, far more serious than this. But what bothered him most wasn't the fine. It was the arrogance, the way they thought they could bully people into giving in. That night, he gathered every letter, every email, every photo into a binder. He organized them by date and added notes about each encounter. Then he made copies, one for himself, one for the county housing authority, and one for a lawyer he knew through a friend. He wasn't sure if he'd need them yet, but it never hurt to be prepared. Days passed quietly until one morning, just after sunrise, the sound of a diesel engine woke him up. He looked out his window and froze. Another tow truck was parked in front of his driveway. A man in a reflective vest was standing by the front tire of his truck, clipboard in hand. John walked outside, calm and steady. "Morning," he said, his voice level. "Can I help you?" The man looked up. "We've got an order from the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association to remove this vehicle for unpaid fines. Do you have a legal order from the city or just from them?" John asked. The man hesitated. "Just from the HOA, sir." "Then you're not touching it," John said. "You try to move it and you'll be trespassing." The man looked uncomfortable. "I'm just doing my job." "I get that," John said, his tone softening slightly. "But you're about to do someone else's dirty work. Check your paperwork again." The man looked down at the form. "It says authorized by HOA President Carl. Then you might want to leave before you end up in the middle of something bigger than you expected," John said quietly. The man nodded, folded the paper, and walked back to his truck. As he was about to leave, he said, "For what it's worth, sir, this happens more often than you'd think." John gave him a small nod. "I'm starting to believe that." Within half an hour, the tow truck was gone. But not before half the neighborhood had peeked through their blinds. John could feel the eyes, the whispers starting even before the sound of the truck faded. By noon, he received an email from the HOA. It accused him of interfering with official enforcement actions and warned that additional penalties could be imposed. John almost laughed at how ridiculous it was. They were pushing harder, and it only confirmed what he already knew. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was personal. That evening, as he was sitting on his porch, a neighbor from across the street walked over quietly. She was an older woman who'd lived there even longer than he had. She spoke softly, almost as if afraid someone might hear. "I don't know what's going on, John," she said, "but they've been talking about your truck at the meetings. Carl's been saying you're refusing to follow the rules. John looked at her with a faint smile. That's not surprising. People like him love having something to talk about. She hesitated. Just be careful. They don't like being challenged. I appreciate that, he said sincerely, but I've dealt with worse. After she left, John sat there for a while thinking. He wasn't angry, not the way most people would be. He was focused. There was a calm sort of determination that came over him, the same kind he used to feel before an important mission. He didn't like conflict, but if it came, he made sure he was prepared. The next morning, he went to the county records office. He spent hours looking through documents about the neighborhood's zoning, the HOA charter, and the original property agreements. It took time, but what he found made him pause. The HOA didn't actually have full jurisdiction over the part of the street where his house was built. Years ago, that section was designated as a shared access easement, meaning control was partly under the city's public maintenance authority. In simple terms, the HOA couldn't enforce parking rules on that stretch of the road. He photocopied everything and brought it home, adding the papers to his growing folder of evidence. That same week, Carl sent another letter, this one threatening to file a lien on his property for unpaid dues. That was the last straw. John decided he wouldn't just defend himself. He would expose the whole thing. He drafted a calm, detailed letter to the county homeowners oversight committee, attaching every piece of proof he had, the letters, the harassment, the zoning documents, and a copy of the HOA's own rules. He didn't use emotional words. He didn't complain or accuse. He simply presented facts. Then he mailed it, certified and tracked. A few days later, a reply came from the county office confirming they'd received the complaint and would be reviewing the case. That was all he needed for now. Confirmation that someone outside the neighborhood was finally paying attention. But things didn't stay quiet for long. 2 mornings later, John woke up to loud voices outside. When he stepped out, he saw Carl standing in front of his truck with 2 other board members. They were taking photos again, walking around as if inspecting something. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" John said from the porch. Carl turned, clearly irritated. "We're documenting continued noncompliance. You've ignored multiple notices." John walked closer, staying calm. "You're trespassing on private property. I'd like you to leave." Carl crossed his arms. "You think you can hide behind legal loopholes, but the board's authority stands." John gave a small smile. "You should really read those zoning maps before you talk about authority." Carl frowned. "Excuse me? I've already sent everything to the county," John said quietly. "They'll be in touch with you soon." For the first time, Carl didn't have a quick answer. He looked caught off guard. The other 2 board members shifted uncomfortably. Without another word, they turned and walked off. Carl glared at John one last time before leaving. That evening, John received a text from another neighbor. "He's furious. Said you're trying to make him look bad." John chuckled softly. "He's doing a fine job of that on his own," he muttered. The days that followed were tense but strangely satisfying. For once, the letters stopped. There were no tow trucks, no stickers, no warnings. The street felt normal again, though the silence had a different weight to it, like everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Then, about 2 weeks later, a plain white envelope arrived. No HOA logo this time. It was from the County Housing Authority. The letter confirmed that an investigation into the Maple Ridge HOA's practices had officially begun. It also stated that multiple complaints from other residents had surfaced during the review. Apparently, John wasn't the only one who had been unfairly targeted. He leaned back in his chair, reading it twice. It wasn't victory yet, but it was a start. As the sun set outside, he stepped onto his porch, coffee mug in hand, and looked at his truck sitting peacefully in the driveway. The metal glowed gold in the fading light. It had never looked more steady, more defiant, more symbolic of everything he believed in. Standing your ground, calmly and with purpose. He knew this wasn't over. People like Carl didn't back down easily, but now things were different. The board didn't know it yet, but the balance of power had already started to shift, and John, the quiet man they thought they could push around, was just getting started. Days passed slowly after the letter from the county arrived. The air in the neighborhood felt different. People walked a little quieter. Conversations stopped when John passed by, and even the HOA board members avoided looking his way. Something was changing, and everyone could feel it. John didn't brag about what he'd done. That wasn't his style. He wasn't after revenge or drama. He just wanted peace. To live his life without being bullied by people who thought a little authority made them powerful. Still, he knew this calm wouldn't last. The kind of men like Carl never accepted being challenged quietly. One Monday morning, John was sipping his coffee on the porch when he saw a familiar figure walking up the sidewalk. It was Carl, wearing his usual polo shirt and sunglasses. His walk was stiff, his expression unreadable. John didn't move. He simply waited. "Morning," Carl said as he reached the porch. His voice was tight, like he was forcing politeness. "Morning," John replied calmly. "What can I do for you?" Carl looked around as if making sure no one else was listening. "We need to talk about this complaint you filed." "There's nothing to talk about," John said. "The county's handling it now." Carl stepped closer. "You didn't have to go that far. These things can be handled within the community." John set his coffee down, keeping his eyes steady. "I tried handling it within the community, and several times. You ignored every message, denied my appeals, and tried to tow my truck. You left me no choice." Carl crossed his arms. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. You could have just paid the fines and moved on." John gave a small, humorless smile. "I don't pay for something I didn't do wrong. You know that truck is compliant. You just didn't like it parked there." Carl's jaw tightened. "It doesn't fit the neighborhood's appearance. We have an image to maintain." "An image?" John repeated softly. "You think a truck ruins your image? What about abusing authority, harassing residents, and pocketing money from false fines? Does that fit your image?" For the first time, Carl's eyes flickered. His composure cracked slightly. "Watch what you're accusing me of," he said sharply. John leaned forward just a little. "I don't accuse, I prove." "And I've got proof," Carl didn't reply. He just turned and walked off, his pace faster than before. When he was gone, John exhaled slowly. He wasn't trying to scare the man, he was just tired of being pushed around. People like Carl counted on fear, on the idea that no one would fight back. But John had spent a lifetime dealing with far tougher men than this. The next few days were quiet again, but the silence had weight to it. The HOA board didn't send any new letters. No more orange stickers, but every so often John noticed unfamiliar cars driving slowly past his house. Once he saw a man taking photos from across the street. He didn't react. He just took out his phone and took photos of them in return. Later that week, John got a call from the county housing authority. The woman on the phone introduced herself as an investigator, assigned to review the HOA's conduct. She sounded professional but friendly. "Mr. Miller," she said, "we've reviewed your complaint and found some irregularities. It appears your section of the street isn't fully under HOA jurisdiction, just as you stated. Also, we've received multiple similar reports from other residents." "I figured I wasn't the only one," John said quietly. She continued, "We'll be sending an official notice to the HOA to request documentation. You may hear from them again, but for now, please don't engage directly with them. Let the process handle it." John thanked her and hung up. For the first time in months, he felt a small wave of relief. It wasn't over, but now he knew the fight was moving in the right direction. That evening, he was out front washing his truck when two neighbors walked over. They looked hesitant, like they weren't sure if they should approach. One of them finally spoke up. "We heard about what's happening," the man said quietly. "Honestly, good for you. Most of us have been scared to say anything." John wiped his hands on a towel. "They gave you trouble too?" The man nodded. "They fined me for having my trash can out 10 minutes late. Then they sent another warning because my fence color was too dark. I think they just make up rules to collect more money," the other neighbor added. "Carl's been running the board like it's his kingdom. Everyone just goes along because they're tired of fighting." John nodded slowly. "I understand. But it only takes one person to stand up before others realize they can too." They talked for a while, sharing stories of small injustices, the fines, the threats, the way complaints disappeared whenever Carl's friends were involved. By the time they left, both looked lighter, relieved just to be heard. The next morning, John received an email from the HOA. It was longer than usual, filled with legal-sounding language. They accused him of spreading misinformation and warned that public criticism of the board could result in community sanctions. It was laughable, a desperate attempt to intimidate him. He didn't respond. Instead, he printed the email and added it to his binder. Every threat, every letter. It all went into the growing pile of evidence. That weekend, the county investigator showed up in person. She introduced herself at the door, flashing an official badge. She was polite but direct. "I'd like to ask you a few questions, Mr. Miller, and take a look at some of the documentation you mentioned." He invited her in, offered her coffee, and laid everything out on the table: the letters, photos, copies of the HOA handbook, and zoning documents. She took notes as he spoke, occasionally nodding or raising an eyebrow when he pointed out the inconsistencies. When they were done, she looked up and said, "This is strong evidence. It looks like the board has been issuing fines without legal authority for certain areas. If that's confirmed, they could face serious penalties." John nodded. "I'm not looking to punish anyone. I just want them to stop harassing people." She smiled slightly. "Sometimes holding people accountable is the only way to make that happen." Over the next few days, word spread that the county had officially requested financial records from the HOA. People started whispering more openly now, at the mailbox, at the park, during evening walks. For the first time, Carl wasn't the one everyone was afraid of. One afternoon, as John was trimming his hedges, Carl pulled up in his car and parked across the street. He sat there for a moment before stepping out and walking over. "Still stirring things up, I see," Carl said, trying to sound confident. John didn't look up from his work. "Just keeping things clean, unlike some folks." Carl frowned. "You think you've won something here? You're making this neighborhood look bad." John finally turned, meeting his eyes. "No, Carl, you did that all by yourself." Carl's face reddened. "You're not as clever as you think, Miller. The board has resources. We'll find a way to deal with this." John smiled faintly. "Maybe focus on explaining where the residents' money's been going. That might keep you busier." Carl didn't answer. He stood there for a moment, then walked back to his car. As he drove away, John noticed his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Later that night, a few neighbors stopped by again. One of them brought cookies as a thank you. "You know," she said, "it feels like the whole place is breathing again. People are finally talking about the board and how unfair it's been." John smiled kindly. "I didn't do much. I just refused to be pushed around." "You did more than that," she said. "You reminded us that we don't have to be scared of them." It was strange, John thought, how quickly courage spread once someone took the first step. All he had done was stand his ground, yet it had inspired others to question what they'd quietly accepted for years. 2 weeks later, an official notice arrived in every resident's mailbox. The county was launching a formal audit of the HOA's finances and authority. It also stated that residents could attend a public hearing to discuss their experiences. That single piece of paper sent shockwaves through the entire neighborhood. The hearing was scheduled for a Friday evening at the community center. When the day came, the room was packed. Dozens of homeowners showed up, many holding their own stacks of letters and documents. The investigator sat at the front, and beside her, looking noticeably uncomfortable, was Carl. When it was John's turn to speak, he stood up slowly, holding his binder. His voice was calm, steady, not angry, just firm. He explained everything clearly, from the first false fine to the tow truck incident. He showed the zoning documents that proved the HOA had no legal claim to enforce parking rules on his street. He didn't insult anyone or raise his voice. He simply told the truth. By the time he finished, the room was silent. Then one by one, other residents began to speak, telling their own stories about unfair fines, ignored appeals, and threats. The more they spoke, the smaller Carl seemed to become. When the hearing ended, the county official announced that the HOA board would be placed under temporary supervision until the investigation concluded. Applause broke out across the room. John didn't stay for the celebration. He quietly walked out into the cool evening air and headed home. He wasn't one for public praise. As he reached his driveway, he looked at his truck, still shining, still sitting proudly where it belonged. He took a deep breath and smiled faintly. It wasn't just about the truck anymore. It was about respect, fairness, and standing up when it mattered. And though he didn't know what the investigation would bring next, one thing was clear. The board had finally met its match. For the first time in months, John slept peacefully that night. The fight wasn't over, but justice had finally stepped into the picture. And for a man like him, that was all he ever needed. Not revenge, not recognition. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing he'd done what was right. The days after the community hearing felt different. The air around the neighborhood had a strange calm to it, almost as if everyone was waiting for the next move. For the first time in years, the HOA office door stayed closed more than it was open. The usual patrols that used to drive around checking lawns and mailboxes had disappeared. The weekly reminder emails stopped coming too. John noticed it all, but he didn't celebrate. He knew things like this didn't end overnight. People who liked power didn't give it up easily. He had seen that in the Navy, the way some officers fought to hold on to control even when they were wrong. It wasn't about right or wrong for them. It was about pride. Still, there was a sense of quiet victory in the air. Neighbors who used to avoid him now waved again. Some even stopped by to thank him for what he did. He appreciated it, but he didn't make a big deal of it. He didn't do it for recognition. He just wanted fairness. One morning, as he was fixing a loose shutter on his porch, a man from the county came by. He introduced himself as part of the oversight team assigned to review the HOA's finances and operations. John offered him a cup of coffee and they sat outside, talking for a while. The man explained that the audit had already revealed irregularities, missing receipts, undocumented transactions, and payments that didn't match the HOA's official records. In simple words, someone had been mishandling money. John listened quietly, nodding slowly. "I can't say I'm surprised," he said finally. "People were paying for things that never got fixed." The man nodded. "We're still verifying everything, but it doesn't look good for the current board." Later that afternoon, the news spread fast. Several residents had received letters from the county explaining that the HOA's financial activities were now under full investigation. For years, people had complained about where their dues were going. Now they were finally going to find out. That evening, John went out for his usual walk. The streetlights glowed softly and the sound of crickets filled the air. As he passed by the park, he saw small groups of neighbors talking quietly. When they saw him, a few waved and one called out, "Looks like things are finally changing." He smiled faintly. It was long overdue, he said. But even with the growing sense of relief, there was still tension, especially around Carl. The man had been noticeably quiet since the hearing. His usual emails about community improvements stopped. He didn't show up to board meetings, and when he did, he barely spoke. But John knew silence like that usually meant one thing: planning. Sure enough, a few days later, a thick envelope appeared in John's mailbox. It was from a law firm representing the HOA. The letter claimed that John's statements and actions had caused damage to the HOA's reputation and hinted at possible legal action. John read it carefully, then smiled to himself. He'd been expecting this. He picked up the phone and called the county investigator. "I just received a letter from the HOA's lawyers," he said. "Should I be worried?" The investigator's voice was calm. "Not at all. They're trying to intimidate you. They can't take legal action while they're under state review. Just send us a copy and we'll add it to the case file." John thanked her and hung up. It was exactly what he thought. A scare tactic. A few days later, the HOA's office door was locked and a notice was taped to the window. It said the board's operations were temporarily suspended pending investigation. People started gathering outside, reading the notice out loud, some even taking pictures. One neighbor shook his head and said, "Can you believe this? All these years we paid fees and trusted them." Another added, "We should have stood up sooner. It shouldn't have taken this long." John stood nearby, listening quietly. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The truth was out now. Over the next week, more information came out. The county audit found that thousands of dollars had been misused. Some of it had gone toward consulting services that didn't exist. Other funds had been transferred into personal accounts. Carl's name appeared on several of the transactions. When the news broke officially, it spread like wildfire. People couldn't stop talking about it. The same man who'd tried to fine everyone for small things was now under investigation for something far bigger. John received another call from the county. The investigator thanked him for his cooperation and told him that his documentation had been critical in exposing the wrongdoing. "You helped us connect the dots," she said. "Without your detailed records, this would have taken months longer." John thanked her, but he didn't feel proud. Not exactly. What he felt was a mix of relief and disbelief. It was strange how something that started with a single parking notice had uncovered something so big. A few nights later, John was sitting on his porch when a car pulled up quietly in front of his house. It was Carl. He stepped out looking tired and worn down. His usual confidence was gone. John didn't move. He waited for him to speak. Carl looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, "You really couldn't just let it go, could you?" John's voice stayed even. "You could have stopped all of this months ago." Carl looked down at the ground. "You think I meant for it to get this bad? I was trying to keep things running. People don't understand how hard it is to manage everything. Managing and manipulating aren't the same thing," John said quietly. "You crossed a line." "More than one," Carl sighed. "Maybe I did. But now everything's ruined." "Maybe it needed to be," John replied. "So something better can take its place." Carl didn't answer. He just nodded once and walked back to his car. The sound of the engine faded into the night, leaving only the hum of the crickets and the soft rustle of the trees. The next morning, word spread that Carl had officially resigned as HOA president. The rest of the board followed within days. A temporary committee was appointed by the county to manage things until a new board could be elected. It felt like a fresh start for everyone. That weekend, the neighborhood organized a small gathering at the park. Nothing fancy, just coffee, snacks, and conversation. It was the first time in years that people smiled and laughed together without tension in the air. Some of them even joked about how strange it was to enjoy a Saturday without getting a warning notice. John didn't speak much that day. He mostly listened, smiling quietly as people talked about plans for a better HOA, one that focused on helping, not punishing. Someone suggested forming a resident committee to handle disputes fairly. Another person mentioned holding open meetings so everyone could see where the money went. It was simple, honest talk, the kind of thing that should have been happening all along. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, a few neighbors approached John and asked if he'd consider joining the new HOA board when elections came around. He shook his head gently. "I appreciate that, but I've done my part. I'm not looking to run anything. I just want to live in peace." They nodded, understanding. In the days that followed, life slowly returned to normal. The sound of lawnmowers, kids playing, and dogs barking replaced months of tension. For the first time in a long while, the neighborhood actually felt like a community again. But for John, the experience left a mark. Not a bitter one, just a quiet reminder. It showed him how easily ordinary people could be pushed around when they didn't speak up, and how one voice, steady and patient, could make all the difference. He often thought about the irony of it all. The truck that had caused all the trouble still sat right there in his driveway. Same spot, same shine. It hadn't moved, hadn't changed. It had become a kind of symbol now, not of rebellion but of standing firm without losing your composure. Sometimes, when he washed it on weekends, passing neighbors would wave or give him a thumbs up. A few even called it the truck that beat the HOA, though he always laughed and said it wasn't about winning. It was about fairness, about standing your ground calmly, even when it's uncomfortable. A few weeks later, a letter came from the county, officially closing the investigation. It confirmed that the HOA had violated multiple regulations, and restitution would be made to residents who had been unfairly fined. John read it carefully, then folded it and placed it in his binder, the same one where it all began. He didn't keep it as a trophy, but as a reminder. That evening, he sat on his porch with a cup of tea, watching the sky turn gold and orange. The air was cool and the street was peaceful. No more threats, no more warnings, just quiet. He thought about everything that had happened, how it started with one mistake, one wrong letter taped to his door. It amazed him how far it had gone from there. But that's how life works sometimes. Big changes often started with small moments of standing up. And as the light faded and the first stars appeared, John smiled faintly to himself. He didn't think of it as a fight anymore. It was a lesson, one about patience, courage, and the strength of quiet resolve. The neighborhood had changed, yes, but so had he. For the first time in a long time, everything felt right again. And his truck, his old, faithful truck, sat quietly in the driveway just where it belonged. A few weeks after the investigation ended, the neighborhood started to look different. It wasn't anything dramatic, Just small things that made it feel more alive. People started planting flowers near their mailboxes. Kids were riding bikes again, laughing as they went around the cul-de-sac. There were fewer arguments, fewer complaints. For the first time in a long while, people felt like they could breathe. John noticed these small changes every day. It was in the way people waved when he went out for his morning walk, or how neighbors actually stopped to talk instead of just nodding quickly and hurrying off. The whole place felt lighter, like a weight had finally been lifted. The new temporary HOA committee held open meetings at the community hall every Saturday morning. Anyone could attend, speak, and share ideas. John went to a few, not because he wanted to get involved again, but because he wanted to see how things were shaping up. The meetings were surprisingly calm. There were no raised voices, no hidden agendas, just people trying to figure out what was best for everyone. It was what the HOA was supposed to be all along. A group of neighbors looking after one another, not lording over them. At one meeting, a younger resident stood up and said, "You know, if it wasn't for what happened with the old board, none of us would have spoken up. We just went along with everything because we thought we had no choice." Another person added, "Yeah, we all stayed quiet because it felt easier. But now I see that silence can be dangerous too." John listened quietly from the back of the room, his arms crossed. He didn't say anything, but those words stayed with him. It was a simple truth. People often stayed silent to avoid trouble, not realizing that silence only gave the wrong people more power. Later that day, as he sat on his porch with his cup of coffee, he thought about how different everything felt now. The same houses, the same streets, but somehow everything looked new again. Maybe it was just the peace that came after a long storm. One afternoon, a small envelope arrived in his mailbox. Inside was a handwritten note from one of the temporary board members. It said, "Thank you for standing up when it mattered most. We wouldn't be where we are without you." John smiled softly when he read it. He didn't need thanks, but it was nice to know that people understood why he'd done what he did. He folded the note and placed it in the same binder that held all the letters and documents from the ordeal. It felt like closing a chapter. Over the next few weeks, life fell into a gentle rhythm again. John returned to his old routines: morning walks, tending to the garden, working on small projects around the house. He even started helping a neighbor fix up an old motorcycle that had been sitting unused for years. It reminded him of his Navy days, working with his hands, solving problems, keeping things running. Every so often, he'd see someone park their car on the street or leave their trash bin out a little longer than usual, and he couldn't help but chuckle. A year ago, that would have sparked a warning letter or a fine. Now people just handled things with a quick word or a friendly reminder. One evening, as the sun began to set, John sat outside watching the sky turn orange and pink. Across the street, a few kids were playing catch, their laughter echoing through the air. He thought about how much had changed in such a short time. The whole neighborhood had gone from divided and tense to open and friendly again. His phone buzzed with a message from a neighbor. "We're having a community cookout this weekend at the park. Hope you can make it," he smiled. For a long time, gatherings like that never happened. People used to avoid each other because of fear of fines, rules, and arguments. But now they were coming together again. That Saturday, he decided to go. When he arrived at the park, it was already buzzing with chatter and laughter. Tables were set up with homemade food: barbecue, pies, salads, and lemonade. Music played softly from a speaker, and kids ran around chasing bubbles. It felt like what a neighborhood should feel like: warm, welcoming, alive. When people saw him, several came over to greet him. Some shook his hand, others patted him on the back. One older lady said, "We owe you a lot, you know. You didn't just save your truck, and you helped save this place." John smiled and said, "All I did was speak up. The rest of you did the hard part. You changed things." The woman laughed. "Maybe, but we needed someone to remind us we could." As the evening went on, people started sharing stories, funny ones about old HOA rules, the strange letters they used to get, and how relieved they were that it was finally over. Everyone laughed, not in anger but in relief. It was as if the whole neighborhood had collectively let go of something heavy. When the sun went down, a few people lit lanterns and placed them around the park. The soft glow spread across the grass, and for a moment everything felt calm and perfect. John stood near the edge of the park watching everyone, the families, the laughter, the togetherness. He realized that maybe all the trouble had been worth it after all. On his way home, he passed his truck sitting proudly in the driveway. It looked the same as always, but now it felt like a part of the story. Not just a vehicle, but a symbol of standing firm when things get unfair. He ran his hand along the side of it and smiled. Days turned into weeks, and soon the new HOA elections took place. A group of honest, hard-working residents were chosen, people who believed in transparency and fairness. They even introduced a new rule. Any community decision had to be voted on by residents directly. It was simple but powerful. When one of the new board members visited John to thank him again, he said, "You know, you should have been on this board." John chuckled. "No, I've had enough of rules and meetings. I'll stick to my garden." The man laughed. "Fair enough. But if you ever change your mind, we'd be lucky to have you." After that, John didn't hear much from the HOA, which in his mind was exactly how it should be. No threats, no warnings, no unnecessary drama, just peace. Sometimes people passing by his house would slow down to admire the truck or wave at him while walking their dogs. A few even stopped to chat, asking for advice about small home repairs or gardening tips. He always took the time to help. That's just who he was, calm, steady, and patient. One quiet evening, as the sky darkened and crickets started their nightly song, John sat on his porch and thought about everything that had happened. It amazed him how one simple thing, a parking notice, had turned into such a journey. It wasn't about revenge or proving someone wrong. It was about standing up for what was fair and not letting fear win. He thought about Carl sometimes, and not with anger but with understanding. People made mistakes, some worse than others, but he believed everyone could learn from them. Maybe Carl had learned something too. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the peaceful sounds around him. There were no arguments, no shouting, no letters taped to doors, just calm. The kind of calm that came from lessons learned and problems solved. After all that had happened, John felt something deeper than victory. He felt gratitude. Grateful that things had turned out right. Grateful that his neighbors had found their voice. And grateful that he could finally enjoy his home without tension hanging over it. A light breeze passed through, carrying the faint scent of flowers from a nearby yard. He smiled, looking out over the quiet street. His truck gleamed softly under the porch light, a silent reminder of everything that had happened, and everything that had changed. Sometimes standing up doesn't mean shouting or fighting. Sometimes it just means holding your ground calmly and believing that the truth will speak for itself. That's what John had done, and it made all the difference. He took a slow sip of his tea and let out a deep breath. The neighborhood had found peace again, and so had he. For the first time in a long while, he didn't think about what could go wrong. He just enjoyed the quiet, the stillness, and the simple beauty of being home. And as the night settled in, the streetlights glowed softly, casting a warm light over the truck that had started it all. It stood there, steady, strong and unmoved, just like him.